3 days after my father's funeral, my stepmother stood at the front door of the house I grew up in, holding one of my suitcases in her hand while cold rain poured across the porch lights. And she calmly told me I had exactly 1 hour to take my things and leave the property forever. She said the house belonged to her now, that my father had made his decision before he died, and that I needed to accept reality like an adult. But what she didn't know was that my father had left behind one final letter, a letter nobody had seen yet, and inside that envelope was a truth powerful enough to destroy every lie she had spent years building around our family. My name is Emma Carter and I am 32 years old. I grew up just outside Asheville, North Carolina, in a quiet white farmhouse sitting at the edge of a long stretch of land filled with maple trees, old wooden fences, and rolling green hills that looked golden every autumn. My father used to tell me that our family owned that land long before highways and shopping centers swallowed most of the county, and every single time he said it, there was pride in his voice. He loved that farmhouse more than anything he owned in this world because he had built most of it with his own hands after marrying my mother. Every wall carried memories. Every room carried history. And when I was a child, I honestly believed nothing bad could ever happen inside that home. My mother, Sarah Carter, was the heart of our family. She had this calm warmth about her that made every problem in the world feel smaller the moment she walked into a room. Even during difficult times, she somehow managed to make life feel stable. She painted landscapes in the evenings, baked homemade pies every Sunday morning, and played old country music while cleaning the kitchen. Some of my happiest childhood memories are simple moments involving her laughter echoing through the house while sunlight came through the windows. Back then, our family felt complete. But everything changed when I was 14 years old because that was the year my mother was diagnosed with cancer. At first, the doctors sounded hopeful. They talked about treatments, recovery plans, and survival rates, and my father held on to every optimistic word they gave us. But cancer does not care about hope. It slowly destroyed her over the next year, and I still remember the exact moment I realized she was not going to survive. I was sitting beside her hospital bed late one night while snow fell outside the window, and she reached over, held my hand weakly, and told me to always take care of my father because he was stronger than people realized, but far lonelier than he ever admitted. She died 3 weeks later. After losing her, my father changed in ways I did not fully understand at the time. He still tried to be a good dad. He still packed my school lunches and showed up to baseball games and helped me with homework after long shifts at the lumber mill. But grief slowly hollowed him out from the inside. The laughter disappeared first. Then his energy. Then the spark in his eyes. He spent more evenings sitting silently on the porch staring into the distance, holding a coffee mug that usually went cold before he finished drinking it. Sometimes I would catch him standing alone in my mother's old art room late at night, looking at her unfinished paintings without saying a word. For 2 years, it was just the two of us trying to survive the emptiness left behind after her death. Then one evening, my father told me he had met someone. Her name was Victoria Hale. The first time I saw her, she looked completely out of place in our world. She arrived at the farmhouse wearing expensive boots, a long beige coat, and enough jewelry to make it obvious she cared deeply about appearances. She was attractive in a polished, calculated kind of way, but there was something cold hiding underneath her smile. Even at 16 years old, I could sense it immediately. She spoke carefully, as if every sentence was rehearsed before leaving her mouth. My father, however, looked happier around her than he had looked in years, and because I missed seeing him smile, I tried convincing myself to give her a chance. that lasted less than 2 months. Victoria never directly insulted me in the beginning. She was smarter than that. Instead, she made subtle comments disguised as concern. She criticized the farmhouse constantly, claiming it felt outdated and isolated. She suggested replacing my mother's decorations with something more modern. She talked about renovating entire sections of the house even though my father clearly loved it exactly the way it was. Slowly, little pieces of my mother started disappearing from our home. Her paintings were moved into storage. Her old furniture vanished. Family photographs were removed from shelves and replaced with expensive decorations Victoria picked herself. Then she started changing my father. At first, it seemed harmless. She bought him new clothes and encouraged him to eat healthier. But over time, the changes became deeper and more controlling. She criticized his friends, his hobbies, and even the way he spoke sometimes. If he laughed too loudly or made an old-fashioned joke, she would roll her eyes like he embarrassed her. And the worst part was watching my father slowly become quieter around her. The man who once filled every room with warmth suddenly looked nervous inside his own home. One night during dinner, when I was 17, Victoria casually looked at me and asked if I had considered moving out after graduation because young men need independence. My father immediately defended me, saying I could stay as long as I wanted, but I still noticed the brief irritation in Victoria's expression after he said it. That was the moment I realized she did not see me as family. She saw me as an obstacle. After high school, I moved to Charlotte for college and later found work in construction management. Even though I lived several hours away, I still came home often because I worried about my father constantly. Every visit made me more uncomfortable. Victoria controlled nearly every aspect of his life by then. She handled the finances, scheduled appointments, answered questions directed at him, and constantly monitored conversations whenever he and I spent time alone together. It felt less like she was his wife and more like she was managing him. Still, despite the tension, my father never stopped trying to maintain a relationship with me. Every birthday morning, he called me at exactly 7 o'clock. Every Christmas, he mailed handwritten cards filled with personal messages instead of generic greetings. And every single phone call ended with the same words, "Love you, daughter." That is why everything that happened later confused me so deeply, because no matter how distant things became between us, I never doubted that my father loved me. When I was 28 years old, my father suffered his first heart attack. I remember driving through a thunderstorm from Charlotte to Asheville after Victoria called me from the hospital. The entire drive, I kept imagining losing him the same way I lost my mother, and by the time I arrived, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the steering wheel. Victoria met me outside his hospital room with crossed arms and immediately told me he needed rest. I ignored her and walked inside anyway. Seeing my father lying in that hospital bed terrified me because he suddenly looked old. Truly old. The strongest man I knew had always seemed invincible growing up, but in that moment, he looked fragile. Weak. Temporary. We talked quietly for almost an hour, while machines beeped softly around us. Most of the conversation sounded normal at first. He asked about work, my apartment, and whether I was eating properly. But then his expression changed. He looked toward the doorway to make sure Victoria was not standing nearby before lowering his voice. "Took me too long to realize some things," he said. I frowned and asked what he meant. "If anything happens to me, there are things you don't know." I told him not to talk like that because hearing those words scared me, but he kept staring at me with this strange seriousness in his eyes, like he was trying desperately to warn me about something important. Before he could continue, Victoria walked back into the room carrying coffee cups, and my father immediately went silent. At the time, I convinced myself he was emotional because of the heart attack. Later, I realized he had been trying to protect me. Over the next few years, his health slowly declined. He continued working less and spending more time at home, while Victoria became increasingly controlling. She often claimed stress was dangerous for his condition and used that excuse to limit how much time we spent together. Phone calls became shorter. Visits became less frequent. Sometimes I wondered if he intentionally pulled away from me, but deep down, something about the situation never felt natural. Then came the phone call that changed everything. It was November 14th, and cold rain hammered against my apartment windows while I finished paperwork from work late at night. My phone rang just before midnight, and when I saw Victoria's name on the screen, I felt immediate dread in my stomach. The moment I answered, she calmly said, "Your father passed away." No emotion. No tears. Just 4 words delivered like business information. I do not remember much about the drive back to Asheville because my mind barely functioned during those hours. I remember rain. Headlights. My hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly they hurt. When I finally arrived at the farmhouse before sunrise, the house looked darker than I had ever seen it. Victoria opened the door wearing black silk pajamas and looked irritated more than sad. "You should have called before arriving," she said. I stared at her in disbelief because my father had been dead for only a few hours. Inside the house, everything looked exactly the same, and somehow that made the pain worse. My father's reading glasses still sat beside his favorite chair near the fireplace. His boots still rested near the back door. It felt impossible that someone so present could suddenly be gone forever. I walked into his office alone, closed the door behind me, and completely broke down. The funeral happened 4 days later under gray skies and freezing rain. Nearly the entire town attended because my father was respected by everyone who knew him. Former co-workers from the lumber mill came. Old neighbors came. Friends I had not seen in years came. And throughout the entire service, Victoria performed perfectly as the grieving widow. She cried at the right moments, lowered her voice at the right moments, and accepted sympathy from everyone around her like an actress accepting applause after a performance. But I noticed things other people missed. I noticed how quickly she brought up financial paperwork whenever conversations became private. I noticed how impatient she looked whenever someone spent too much time speaking to me. And most importantly, I noticed that she never once looked truly heartbroken. 3 days after the funeral, I returned to the farmhouse after helping clean up the church reception hall, only to discover the locks had been changed. At first, I honestly thought there had been some mistake. Then the front door opened, and Victoria stepped outside holding one of my suitcases. She looked directly at me and calmly said, "You need to take the rest of your things tonight." I could barely process what I was hearing. "You can't be serious," I said. "This house belongs to me now," she replied without hesitation. "My father built this house. And your father left everything to his wife." Hearing those words felt like being punched in the chest, because part of me suddenly feared she might be telling the truth. What if my father really had chosen her over me in the end? What if years of distance had changed how he felt about me? Victoria placed the suitcase on the porch and folded her arms. "You're 32 years old, Emma. It's time to move on." Rain poured behind me while anger and grief twisted together inside my chest. "This is my home," I told her. "No," she replied coldly. "It was your home." She gave me exactly 1 hour to remove the rest of my belongings from the property. I loaded boxes into my truck silently, while she watched from the doorway like security guarding private property. The final thing I grabbed was an old framed photograph of my father and me holding fishing rods beside a lake when I was 10 years old. Victoria glanced at the picture and smirked slightly. "You can keep the sentimental junk." I nearly lost control right there on the porch, but something stopped me. Maybe instinct. Maybe my father's voice in the back of my mind. So instead of arguing, I drove away from the only home I had ever truly loved and checked into a cheap roadside motel outside Asheville. That night, I sat on the edge of the bed staring at the fishing photograph for hours while one thought repeated in my head over and over again. None of this felt right. My father loved that house too much. He loved me too much. And no matter how complicated things became between us over the years, I could not believe he would erase me completely from his life. Then I remembered the conversation in the hospital years earlier. If anything happens to me, there are things you don't know. For the first time, I understood what he had been trying to say. The next morning, my phone rang from an unknown number. When I answered, a calm older man introduced himself as Daniel Reeves, my father's attorney. He explained that my father had left behind additional documents that needed to be reviewed privately and requested I meet him immediately at his office in downtown Asheville. Confused, I asked what kind of documents he meant. There was a brief silence before he answered carefully. "Your father left a personal letter addressed specifically to you, Emma. And based on his instructions, I believe he expected you would need to read it very soon." At that exact moment, sitting alone inside a cheap motel room with rain hitting the windows, I realized something terrifying. My father knew something before he died. And whatever truth waited inside, that final letter was important enough for him to hide it from his own wife. The moment Daniel Reeves told me my father had left behind a private letter that Victoria knew nothing about, I felt something shift inside me for the first time since my father died. Up until that phone call, grief had completely buried my ability to think clearly. I had spent days feeling numb, confused, and betrayed. But suddenly, beneath all that pain, another emotion started growing. Suspicion. Because deep down, I knew my father. He was not a perfect man, but he was loyal to the people he loved, and no matter how complicated things became between us over the years, I could not believe he would intentionally leave me with nothing while handing everything to Victoria, without explanation. I drove into downtown Asheville that morning under heavy gray skies, while dozens of questions raced through my head. Daniel Reeves' office was located inside an old brick building near the courthouse, the kind of place that smelled faintly like old paper, coffee, and polished wood. When I walked inside, the receptionist greeted me quietly before leading me toward a private office at the end of the hallway. Daniel Reeves looked exactly like the kind of attorney my father would trust. He was probably in his late 60s, with silver hair, tired eyes, and a calm expression that made him seem more like a history professor than a lawyer. The moment I sat down across from him, he removed his glasses slowly and studied me for several seconds before speaking. "You look just like your father did at your age," he said quietly. Hearing that nearly broke me again. I looked away and asked him directly why he had called me. Daniel leaned back in his chair and folded his hands carefully. "Before your father passed away, he gave me very specific instructions regarding certain documents. He told me these documents were only to be shared with you privately and only after his death." "Why privately?" I asked immediately. Daniel hesitated. "Because he believed there was a strong possibility his wife would interfere." The moment he said those words, my stomach tightened. "You mean Victoria?" "Yes." That single answer changed everything. Until that point, part of me still questioned whether grief was making me paranoid. But hearing my father's attorney openly confirm concerns about Victoria made me realize my instincts had been right all along. Daniel opened a folder sitting on his desk and carefully removed a sealed envelope with my name written across the front in my father's handwriting. Just seeing his handwriting again hit me harder than I expected. For a moment, I could not move. Daniel slid the envelope toward me slowly. "Your father wanted you to read this first." My hands shook slightly as I opened it. Inside was a handwritten letter several pages long. I immediately recognized the uneven pressure of my father's pen strokes, because he always wrote too hard when he was emotional. I took a deep breath and started reading. "Emma, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and I am sorry for that more than words can explain. I know things between us became distant over the years, and I need you to understand something before anything else. None of that distance was your fault. I should have protected you better. I should have spoken sooner. And I should never have ignored the things I knew in my heart." By the second paragraph, my vision blurred from tears. I kept reading. "Victoria is not the person she pretends to be." I realized that too late. For years, I convinced myself I was imagining things because I did not want to believe I had brought someone dangerous into our family after your mother died. But I started noticing missing money, hidden accounts, forged signatures, and conversations that stopped whenever I entered a room. When I confronted her, she always manipulated me into doubting myself. I looked up at Daniel in shock. He nodded slowly like he already knew what the letter contained. I continued reading. 3 years ago, I hired a private investigator after discovering withdrawals from accounts I never authorized. What he found terrified me. Victoria has enormous gambling debts. She also maintained contact with multiple men while pretending to be devoted to our marriage. I planned to file for divorce, but after my first heart attack, my health worsened faster than I expected, and I realized I might not have enough time. I stopped breathing for a second. Everything around me suddenly made sense. The control, the manipulation, the constant isolation. My father had known. He had known for years. The letter continued. "I did not tell you because I feared she would retaliate against you financially or legally before I could protect the estate properly. So I made arrangements quietly. Emma, listen to me carefully. The farmhouse, the land, and nearly all family assets were never placed under Victoria's ownership. Legally, they belong to the Carter Family Trust, which transfers entirely to you upon my death." I stared at the page in disbelief. "What?" I whispered aloud. Daniel leaned forward calmly. "Your father created the trust after his first heart attack." My heart started pounding violently. "That house belongs to me?" Daniel nodded once. "Legally, yes." I could barely process what I was hearing. For days, Victoria had acted like she owned everything. She had thrown me out of my childhood home, while pretending my father left me nothing. But according to this letter, she never owned the property at all. I looked back down and continued reading faster. "Victoria believes she inherited everything because I allowed her to think that. Daniel has the full documentation necessary to protect you legally. But there is something even more important you need to know. The reason I delayed finalizing the divorce was because I feared what Victoria might do if cornered. There are people connected to her life before our marriage who frightened me deeply. If she realizes you know the truth, be careful." That sentence sent cold chills down my spine. The final section of the letter was harder to read because tears kept blurring the ink. "I know I failed you in many ways after your mother died. I let grief make me weak, and loneliness made me blind. But never doubt this one truth. I loved you every single day of my life. Everything I built was always meant to become yours. The farmhouse belongs to our family, Not to someone who tried to destroy it. I am proud of the man you became, and I hope one day you can forgive me. Love always, Dad. By the time I finished reading, I could not speak. I sat there staring at the final signature, while emotions crashed through me all at once. Grief, relief, anger, guilt. For years, part of me believed my father had chosen Victoria over me. But the truth was far more painful. He had been trapped. Daniel allowed me several minutes before speaking again. Your father cared about you deeply, he said quietly. I wiped my face and asked the question burning inside my mind. If the trust gives me ownership of the house, why did Victoria act like everything belonged to her? Daniel opened another folder. Because your father intentionally delayed filing several documents publicly until after his death. Victoria only saw the basic will summary, which mentioned financial support provisions for her. She assumed that meant full ownership. And it doesn't? No, he slid several legal papers across the desk toward me. The trust controls the farmhouse, the surrounding land, your father's investment accounts, and several other assets. Victoria receives a monthly settlement payment for 10 years, but she has no ownership claim over the property itself. I almost laughed from pure disbelief. After humiliating me, throwing me out, and treating me like I was worthless, Victoria technically owned nothing except temporary payments. Then another thought hit me immediately. She changed the locks yesterday. Daniel sighed. That complicates matters slightly, but legally she cannot remove you from the property. In fact, based on these documents, you now have authority to remove her. Hearing those words felt unreal. 24 hours earlier, I was sitting alone in a motel room believing I had lost everything connected to my family forever. Now I was learning the exact opposite. But beneath the relief, another feeling kept growing stronger, anger, not just because Victoria lied, but because she spent years manipulating my father while pretending to love him. I asked Daniel directly whether Victoria knew about the gambling debts mentioned in the letter. Oh, she knows, he answered calmly. Your father covered significant financial losses repeatedly during their marriage. How bad were the debts? Daniel looked uncomfortable for the first time. At one point, nearly $400,000. I stared at him. You're serious? Yes. Casinos, private lenders, online gambling accounts. Your father quietly paid off several collections agencies over the years to protect the family name. I leaned back in shock. The woman who constantly criticized everyone else for irresponsibility had secretly burned through hundreds of thousands of dollars behind closed doors. Then Daniel handed me another document. This is where things become more concerning. I looked down at the paper. It was a financial report showing recent attempts to borrow against the farmhouse property. My stomach dropped instantly. She tried taking loans against the house? She attempted to, Daniel corrected. But the trust structure prevented approval. I suddenly understood why Victoria had been so eager to remove me quickly after the funeral. She thought she owned the property and probably planned to sell it or borrow against it immediately. And if that happened before I discovered the truth, the legal mess could have taken years to untangle. My father knew exactly what she would try to do. That was why he hid everything so carefully. Daniel eventually stood and walked toward the office window before speaking again. There's something else you should know. What? Yesterday afternoon, Victoria contacted my office demanding immediate transfer authority over several accounts. I frowned. What did you tell her? That additional legal review was necessary. Daniel turned back toward me. She was extremely aggressive. I could imagine that perfectly. The calm, elegant image Victoria showed the world disappeared quickly whenever she lost control. What happens now? I asked. Daniel walked back to his desk. Now we formally execute your father's final directives. Legally, the property ownership transfers to you immediately. My chest tightened. That farmhouse.my childhood home.my parents' home. Still ours. Still protected. For the first time since my father died, I felt like I could finally breathe again. But Daniel was not finished. There is one problem, he said carefully. I frowned. What problem? Victoria still believes she owns everything. And based on her recent behavior, I strongly doubt she will surrender control peacefully. Outside the office windows, thunder rolled across downtown Asheville while rain slammed against the glass, and sitting there holding my father's final letter in my hands, I realized something important. This was no longer just about inheritance, this was war. The moment Daniel Reeves told me Victoria would probably not surrender control peacefully, I realized the nightmare was far from over. For a brief moment after reading my father's letter, I had actually felt relief. I thought the truth alone would fix everything. I thought once the legal documents were revealed, Victoria would simply accept reality and leave quietly. But deep down, I already knew someone like her would never walk away willingly, especially not from money. Daniel spent the next hour explaining the legal structure of the Carter family trust in detail, while I tried processing everything at once. My father had created the trust several years earlier after his first heart attack, and according to Daniel, he had done it very carefully. The farmhouse, nearly 70 acres of surrounding land, multiple investment accounts, and even portions of my father's retirement savings had all been transferred into protected ownership long before his death. Legally, Victoria had no authority to sell the property, borrow against it, or remove me from the estate. But the problem was simple. Victoria did not know that yet, and based on what Daniel had described, she had already started making financial moves assuming she controlled everything. What happens when she finds out? I asked quietly. Daniel looked exhausted before answering. Honestly, I expect a very ugly reaction. I rubbed my forehead while trying to calm my thoughts. Can she fight the trust? She can try, Daniel replied. But the documents are solid. Your father anticipated challenges. He documented everything carefully. Then why do I feel like this is about to get worse? Daniel gave me a grim look. Because people become dangerous when money disappears. That sentence stayed in my head long after I left his office. The rain had stopped outside, but dark clouds still covered most of Asheville as I drove back toward the motel. Every memory of Victoria suddenly looked different now. All those years of manipulation, all those fake smiles, all those carefully controlled conversations suddenly made horrifying sense. She had not married my father because she loved him. She married him because she saw stability, property, and financial security. And somehow my father realized the truth too late. Back at the motel, I sat on the edge of the bed staring at his letter again for almost an hour. Certain parts hurt more each time I reread them. I should have protected you better. Those words crushed me because I knew how much guilt my father must have carried during his final years. He probably felt trapped inside his own marriage while watching the family he built slowly disappear around him. Around 6 that evening, my phone rang. Victoria. For several seconds, I considered ignoring the call. Then I answered. Her voice sounded irritated immediately. Where are you? I stayed calm. Why? Because several of your boxes are still in the garage. The sheer arrogance in her tone almost made me laugh. You threw me out, remember? You had 1 hour. Whatever remains gets donated tomorrow. I leaned back slowly. I wouldn't do that if I were you. Silence, then her voice sharpened. Excuse me. I said I wouldn't do that. Something changed instantly in the atmosphere between us. Victoria was extremely good at controlling conversations, but she also had excellent instincts. She could sense when someone stopped being weak. And why exactly is that? She asked carefully. I looked down at my father's letter. Because the house doesn't belong to you. Dead silence, for almost 5 full seconds. Neither of us spoke. Then she laughed softly. I think grief is affecting your judgment. No, I replied calmly. I spoke with Daniel Reeves this morning. The moment I mentioned Daniel's name, her tone changed completely. What did he tell you? He told me the truth. Another silence followed, but this one felt colder. When Victoria finally spoke again, her voice had lost all warmth. You should be very careful about believing things you don't fully understand. And you should be careful about changing locks on property you don't own. I heard her breathing tighten slightly through the phone. Then she said something that truly shocked me. Your father was confused near the end. I sat upright immediately. What? He wasn't thinking clearly during his final months. You know how sick he became. Anger exploded inside me instantly because now she was trying to rewrite my father himself. He knew exactly what he was doing. You have no idea what you're talking about, Emma. No, I said coldly. I finally do. Then I hung up. For the first time in my life, I had heard genuine fear hiding underneath Victoria's composure, and that terrified me more than her anger ever did. About 20 minutes later, Daniel called me unexpectedly. She contacted my office. He said immediately, that fast. She's panicking. I stood and walked toward the motel window. What did she say? She demanded copies of the trust documents and threatened legal action. I almost laughed. Can she get them? Not without formal procedure. Daniel paused briefly before continuing. But Emma, there's something else. His tone made my stomach tighten. What? She also asked whether your father left behind additional written statements. I looked down at the letter in my hand. She knows about the letter? She suspects. A cold feeling spread through my chest, because if Victoria feared what my father wrote about her, then she probably understood exactly how dangerous the truth could become. That night, I barely slept. Every creak outside the motel room made me tense. Every car door in the parking lot pulled my attention toward the window. Maybe it sounds paranoid, but after reading my father's warning about the people connected to Victoria's past, I could not stop imagining worst-case scenarios. Around 3 in the morning, I finally fell asleep. Then my phone rang at 6:12 a.m. Daniel again. But this time, his voice sounded urgent. You need to get to the farmhouse immediately. I sat up instantly. What happened? There was an attempted property inspection early this morning. I frowned. What does that mean? It means Victoria invited a real estate evaluator to the property. My blood turned cold. She's trying to sell the house? She's trying to move quickly before formal documents are filed publicly. I was already pulling on my jacket. Can she do that? No, Daniel answered sharply. But she clearly intends to try. The drive back to the farmhouse felt surreal. The closer I got to home, the more memories returned. Riding bicycles down the gravel driveway as a kid. Fishing with my father near the creek behind the property. Helping him repair fences during summer weekends. Every part of that land carried pieces of our family, and Victoria almost stole all of it. When I finally pulled into the driveway, I immediately saw 2 unfamiliar vehicles parked outside the house. One belonged to a local real estate company. The other looked like a property assessor's SUV. Victoria stood near the porch speaking with a man in a gray coat while holding a folder. The moment she saw my truck, her entire expression hardened. I stepped out slowly while Daniel parked behind me moments later. The man in the gray coat looked confused immediately. Victoria recovered quickly and forced a smile. "Emma," she said coldly. "You're trespassing." Daniel walked forward before I could answer. "Actually, Mrs. Hale, he is not." Victoria's face changed instantly. The real estate evaluator looked between all of us awkwardly. Daniel calmly removed several documents from his briefcase. "I believe you've misunderstood the ownership status of this property." For the first time since I met her years ago, I saw genuine panic flicker across Victoria's face. "What are you talking about?" she snapped. Daniel handed the evaluator copies of the trust paperwork. "This property belongs to the Carter Family Trust, effective several years prior to Mr. Carter's death. Ownership transferred fully Emma Carter yesterday morning." The evaluator's eyes widened immediately. I wasn't aware of that." "Clearly," Daniel replied calmly. Victoria stepped forward aggressively. "That's impossible." "No," Daniel said. "It is legally documented." She grabbed the paperwork from his hands and scanned the pages rapidly. The color drained from her face line by line. I watched the exact moment reality hit her. She never owned the house, not for a single second. Everything she planned collapsed right there in the driveway. "This is fraudulent," she whispered. Daniel stayed perfectly calm. "It was reviewed by 3 independent attorneys." Victoria looked at me then, and the hatred in her eyes genuinely shocked me. Not sadness, not frustration. Hatred. "You did this," she said quietly. I stared back at her. "No. My father did." For several seconds, nobody moved. Then Victoria completely lost control. "You think this is over?" she screamed suddenly. "You think you can steal everything from me after everything I sacrificed?" The evaluator immediately stepped backward awkwardly toward his vehicle. Daniel remained calm. "Mrs. Hale, I strongly advise you to lower your voice." But she ignored him entirely. "I spent years taking care of that man while his ungrateful son disappeared." I took a step forward angrily. "I didn't disappear. You pushed everyone away from him." "That's a lie. You isolated him from his friends, his family, and everyone who cared about him." Victoria's face twisted with rage. "You have no idea what your father was really like." The moment she said that, something inside me snapped. "Don't," I warned quietly, but she kept going. "He was weak, lonely, pathetic after your mother died." I moved toward her so fast Daniel had to physically step between us. "Careful," Daniel said sharply. Victoria laughed bitterly. "You know what your father's problem was? He needed people to need him. That's why he kept cleaning up everyone's messes." The words hit me instantly. Everyone's messes. Not family. Not ours. Hers. And suddenly I realized something horrifying. Victoria never loved my father at all. She resented him. All those years she stayed because he funded her lifestyle, protected her reputation, and covered her debts. But underneath it all, she looked down on him completely. That realization hurt more than I expected. Because my father died believing he failed his family, when in reality, he spent years sacrificing himself for someone who never deserved him. Daniel eventually instructed the evaluator to leave while Victoria stood trembling near the porch. Then he turned toward her calmly. "Mrs. Hale, legally you have 72 hours to vacate the property." Her eyes widened. "You're throwing me out?" The irony of that question nearly made me laugh. 3 days earlier, she stood in this exact driveway throwing me out of my childhood home without remorse. Now the situation had reversed completely. But instead of satisfaction, I mostly felt exhausted. Victoria looked at me desperately for the first time. "Emma, listen to me." I said nothing. "There are things your father never told you." I stared at her carefully. "What things?" She hesitated. And in that hesitation, I knew she was calculating another lie. Then her phone rang suddenly. She glanced at the screen. And for the first time all morning, real fear appeared on her face. Not anger, fear. She declined the call immediately. But less than 10 seconds later, it rang again. Daniel noticed her reaction too. "Everything all right?" he asked. Victoria forced a smile quickly. "Fine." But I knew it wasn't. Because whatever name appeared on that screen scared her far more than losing the house. And deep down, I suddenly understood something terrifying. My father's warning in the letter was real. Victoria was hiding something much darker than gambling debts. And whatever secret she spent years protecting was finally starting to unravel. The moment I saw fear appear on Victoria's face after that phone call, I realized this situation was far bigger than hidden debts and lies about inheritance. Up until then, I believed the worst thing she had done was manipulate my father emotionally and try stealing the farmhouse after his death. But something about the way her expression changed told me there were secrets buried much deeper than money. She declined the call quickly and shoved the phone into her coat pocket, but her hands were shaking slightly now. Daniel noticed it too. "You seem nervous." "Mrs. Hale," he said calmly. Victoria forced a smile. "I'm perfectly fine." But she wasn't. For the first time since my father died, the woman standing in front of me no longer looked confident or in control. She looked cornered. Daniel handed her the official notice requiring her to vacate the property within 72 hours. She grabbed the papers aggressively without even reading them properly. "This isn't over," she said coldly. Daniel remained calm. "Legally, it is." She looked directly at me again then. And there was something almost desperate hiding behind her anger now. "Your father wasn't innocent, Emma." I frowned immediately. "What's that supposed to mean?" Victoria laughed bitterly. "You really think you knew him?" I took a step closer. "Say what you're trying to say." For a second, she looked like she actually wanted to tell me something. But then her phone rang again. Same number. This time, instead of declining it, she looked genuinely panicked. Daniel crossed his arms. "You should answer that." Victoria glared at him before finally picking up. "Not now," she whispered sharply into the phone. A male voice shouted loudly enough that even I could hear pieces of it from several feet away. "You promised the payment yesterday." Victoria immediately turned away from us. I said, "Not now." The voice kept yelling. Then one sentence became painfully clear. "You think losing that old man's money changes what you owe us?" My stomach tightened instantly. Victoria hung up quickly and looked pale. Daniel stared at her carefully. "Private lenders?" She said nothing, and silence is sometimes the loudest answer. At that moment, I finally understood the full picture. My father had not only been protecting the family from Victoria. He had been protecting us from the people connected to her debts. Suddenly his letter made terrifying sense. "If she realizes you know the truth, be careful." Victoria shoved the papers into her purse and stormed toward the house without another word. Before entering, she stopped briefly and looked back at me one last time. "You have no idea what's coming." Then she slammed the door behind her. The rest of that day felt emotionally exhausting. Daniel stayed with me for several hours helping document the condition of the property and finalize legal transfer paperwork. Every room inside the farmhouse carried memories of my parents, and walking through those rooms again after everything that happened felt surreal. My father's office looked exactly the same as the day he died. His reading glasses still rested beside unfinished paperwork on the desk. His coffee mug still sat near the window. Even his jacket still hung beside the door. It felt like he might walk back inside at any moment. While Daniel reviewed documents in the dining room, I quietly entered my mother's old art room for the first time in years. And what I found there nearly broke me. Most of her paintings had been stacked carelessly against the wall under dusty sheets, exactly where Victoria had hidden them years earlier. I slowly uncovered each canvas one by one while memories flooded back into my mind. Landscapes, family portraits, sketches of the farmhouse during different seasons. My mother had painted pieces of our lives into every corner of that room. Victoria tried erasing all of it, but she failed. Around sunset, Daniel prepared to leave. Before walking out, he handed me one final envelope. "Your father wanted you to have this separately," he explained. I opened it carefully after he left. Inside was an old photograph of my parents standing together on the farmhouse porch years before I was born. Written on the back, in my father's handwriting, was a simple sentence: "Protect this family, even after I'm gone." I sat alone in the living room for a long time after reading those words, and for the first time since my father died, I no longer felt abandoned. I understood him now. He made mistakes. Terrible mistakes. He allowed loneliness and grief to blind him after losing my mother. He ignored warning signs for too long. He failed to protect us early enough, but in the end, he tried to make things right, and he did. The next 2 days were tense. Victoria barely spoke while packing her belongings upstairs. Several expensive cars appeared near the property during that time, usually late at night. Men I did not recognize waited inside those vehicles for long periods before leaving again. Each time it happened, I remembered my father's warning and kept the doors locked. Then, on the third night, everything exploded. It was nearly midnight when loud banging shook the front door. I immediately grabbed my phone and looked outside. Victoria stood on the porch screaming while rain poured around her. Behind her, a black SUV idled near the driveway entrance. I opened the door cautiously but kept the screen door locked. "What do you want?" She looked terrified. Not angry. Terrified. "They're coming," she whispered. I frowned. "Who?" "The men I owe." Lightning flashed across the property, while thunder rolled through the hills. Victoria's mascara had run down her face from rain and crying. She no longer looked polished or elegant. She looked broken. "You need to help me," she said desperately. For several seconds, I honestly did not know how to respond. Part of me hated her for everything she did to my father. But another part of me suddenly saw something different. A woman whose greed destroyed her own life. A woman who spent years chasing money until fear became her entire existence. I stepped outside carefully. "How much do you owe?" She looked away in shame. "More than I can pay." "And my father covered it for years?" She nodded slowly while crying. That answer hurt more than I expected, because it confirmed something painful. My father knew exactly how badly she used him, and he still kept trying to save her anyway. Headlights suddenly appeared at the end of the driveway. The black SUV started moving toward the house slowly. Victoria panicked instantly. "Please," she whispered. "Don't let them take me." I stared at her for several seconds while rain soaked both of us completely. Then I made a decision my younger self never would have understood. I opened the screen door. Get inside. Victoria looked shocked. So you can finally tell the truth. We called the police shortly afterward. The men inside the SUV left before officers arrived, but the situation officially exposed the reality Victoria had hidden for years. Over the following weeks, investigators uncovered massive gambling debts, fraudulent financial activity, and illegal loan agreements connected to several dangerous private lenders. My father had secretly spent years paying people off to keep those problems away from our family, and somehow, despite everything she did to him, he never publicly humiliated her, because that was the kind of man he was. Victoria eventually accepted a plea agreement related to financial fraud charges. She avoided prison time, but lost nearly everything she had left. Before leaving Asheville permanently, she asked to speak with me one final time. We met outside a small coffee shop downtown. She looked older now. Tired. Empty. I did love him, she said quietly. I stayed silent, but not the way he deserved. For once, she sounded honest. I kept thinking money would fix the emptiness inside me, she continued. And by the time I realized what I destroyed, it was too late. I looked out the window toward the streets of Asheville. My father spent his whole life trying to protect this family, I said quietly. Even when nobody protected him. Victoria lowered her eyes. Then she asked the question I never expected. Do you hate me? I thought about it carefully before answering. Years earlier, I probably would have said yes immediately. But standing there after everything that happened, I mostly felt sad. Sad for my father. Sad for the years we lost. Sad for how grief and loneliness destroyed the life he once had with my mother. Finally, I shook my head slowly. No, I answered honestly. But I'll never trust you again. She nodded like she expected that answer all along. Then she walked away. And that was the last time I ever saw Victoria Hale. Months later, life slowly returned to the farmhouse. I restored my mother's paintings to their original places. I repaired old fences around the property. I reopened the garden my mother used to love. And for the first time in many years, the house finally started feeling like home again instead of a battlefield. One evening during autumn, I sat alone on the porch watching sunlight fall across the hills while holding my father's final letter in my hands. For most of my life, I thought strength meant never making mistakes. But my father taught me something different in the end. Real strength means trying to make things right before it's too late, and sometimes, justice arrives quietly. Not through revenge, not through hatred, but through truth finally coming into the light. Because no matter how carefully lies are built, the truth always waits patiently underneath them, and eventually, the truth wins. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to Justice Served Tales for more emotional revenge stories, family drama, and powerful endings that prove karma always finds its way back.